Hello, it's Nadine, and I'm here with this week's episode of Life, Health, and the Universe. And I am joined with Sarah, and I'm going to say your surname. I should have asked you before we hit record. I'm going to pronounce it Cannata.
Correct.
Oh,
Correct.
good,
Big
good.
tick.
Sarah Cannata. So, Sarah, as you know, you've listened to some of previous episodes, so you know that I start every podcast with an introduction of what I know about you. And sometimes I don't know very much. And I don't want to steal your thunder, but I'm just gonna tell the people what I know about you, and you can add all of the bits. So you have a business called Storytelling for the Soul, and you are a journalist, but more recently you are a healer, and you heal your clients through writing. So you're also a published author. I nicked that off your website, and you are an embodied processing practitioner. And I'll just go for some things that I think I know just from what I've seen on Facebook. Or one thing, I think that you're a very committed learner.
Correct. Correct.
And you like getting things done.
Yes, very much so. You've done an
good.
amazing job. I'm very impressed. Very impressed.
So welcome.
Thank you so much
So
for
great
having
to have
me,
you.
first
Yeah.
of all, and most importantly.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this conversation. I'm super curious about what you do. It sounds great. And yeah, really, really super excited about getting stuck into this, this talk, this chat. So tell us about you.
Yes, let's start with picking apart the bio. Doesn't that sound like fun?
Yep.
So you're correct. By trade, I'm a journalist, but I've actually worked in communications for over the last 10 years now. So in terms of journalism, I haven't really worked extensively in journalism, but I've dabbled a little bit with my business in the past with public relations and that kind of thing. As you said, I do have a business called Storytelling for the Soul. And I wouldn't really frame it as I heal people through writing. I feel it's more like we work together.
Yes.
And I use writing and then embodied processing techniques, which we can chat about more later, because I know that lots of people probably are not familiar with that terminology. And essentially what we're doing is we're trying to come back and connect with the wisdom of the body. So these sessions, no two sessions look similar. However, whenever we chat with my clients, what we're really trying to do is to welcome all parts of people, and through writing prompts and then the embodied processing, which can look a number of different ways, we're really addressing anything that needs to come up and working with that within the body. So in terms of embodied processing, because I know that you mentioned I'm an embodied processing practitioner, it's a bottom-up approach to working with trauma. So I always say my job within the session is to hold a safe container, because without safety, healing is not possible. But the actual healing itself and what happens within those sessions, there's absolutely no guarantees. And the funny thing is with these sessions, people usually come to me with an issue that they want to work on. So for example, anxiety, or I have a lot of people who are struggling with food, which you can chat about more, and I'll talk that through because it makes sense with my background. We start with that, but where we end up could be in a completely different place altogether. So really that's the storytelling for the soul work. So I see it more as a collaboration with people, and people are really doing the work themselves, because I'm a big believer in holistic healing. So what I also say are my services are definitely not a replacement for any professional medical treatment or anything like that. They're basically complementary. So yeah, I think it's important to frame that way, because I would never say, obviously don't see your GP. Like if people need to go see the GP, psychologist, it's designed to actually work and complement whatever else they're doing. And like I said, holistic healing. So I like blending modalities. So obviously I'm blending writing and the embodied processing with what I do. But then of course, people could also be seeing a naturopath. They could be doing infrared saunas, all this kind of stuff. And I know from myself that with what I've been through, I've been using all of the embodied processing techniques for a while now, and they definitely work. But everyone heals on their own time. I think that's the other important thing to mention. It's not the kind of thing where people come to a session and they say to me, okay, I want to work on anxiety. How many sessions am I going to need with you? That's impossible to answer. We might even get sidetracked in our work from the anxiety. But in a roundabout way, everything always comes full circle, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll stop myself there.
That's all right. You've given us lots of juicy stuff to get started with. I really love that idea, and I know that you said that I think, I mean, what I heard is you're more of a guide, right? That you're there to help lead a person through the session.
Yeah, more of a facilitator.
Facilitator, yeah. But that idea of empowering someone so that they can do that exploration of themselves and heal themselves, essentially, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We're talking about the well, you've mentioned anxiety, you've mentioned food, and it's not necessarily the healing of the anxiety, let's say, or the healing of, or like the food. It's the layers beneath that, right?
Correct.
It's what's causing the anxiety. It's what's causing the desire to eat or have food related sort of addictions. That you're really digging down into.
Yeah, exactly. So, and look, I've done this myself. I've often sought treatment for things that are surfacing. So I think the problem is my anxiety. But when I start working with someone, what I realize, actually, my problem is not the anxiety. I think anxiety is part of the human experience anyway, and it's on a spectrum. And then it gets to a point where it gets so bad that you have to actually go and see someone about it, because it's just impacting every facet of your life. And then suddenly your life is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller because you've developed all of these avoidance strategies and coping behaviors. But then when you delve beneath the anxiety, you're able to connect the dots and track it back. And it could be tracked back to anything. And I should say, when I mentioned trauma, so I work with Dr. Gabor Mate's definition of trauma. I've just seen a very excited face. That's good news. So I think, over the years, we've gotten into this, I guess, spiral of talking about trauma in a way where if someone has a car accident and they're heavily injured, or someone is robbed at knife point, most people can identify, yes, that's a trauma. But with Dr. Mate's work, it's really more about emphasizing this point that trauma is not about the event itself. So if we were talking about a natural disaster, it's not about being stuck in a natural disaster, in a flood, in a fire, whatever it might be. It's about what happens inside you. So if you take that definition, you can very easily see that all humans have trauma on a spectrum, and you can easily track that back to how subjective trauma is, because what is traumatic for one person is not necessarily traumatic for another person. And it's the seemingly most insignificant things that I discover with my clients in my session that are the cause of some really tumultuous challenges later on in their life. So it could be something, and this has happened a couple of times, as insignificant as someone putting up their hand in class as a kid, surrounded by another 20, 30 kids. They ask their question, everyone laughs at them, and they feel ashamed. So it could be something like that impacts their confidence. And then as they're an adult, public speaking, all that kind of stuff becomes a problem. So, I mean, I find it such a fascinating space to work within as well. And I think Dr. Mate and other people like Irene Lyon and so many others, Stephen Porges, they've really led us towards this path of not just talking about big T trauma, but also acknowledging these little T traumas. And for the average person, it's quite hard to identify those smaller T traumas.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes that's the real challenge, because when you can point to something like being stuck in a natural disaster and say, yeah, I'm traumatized from that, that makes sense. And as humans, we're always trying to make sense of things and use the cognitive mind. But when you're having issues, and I've been there myself, and you can't track it back to one specific thing.
Yeah.
And that's really when we're talking about developmental trauma. That's where it's even more confusing. And that confusion leads to a lot of frustration, because you're constantly trying to connect the dots and you just can't quite connect the dots.
Yeah. Yeah. I love, excuse me, the fact that you mentioned Gabor Mate, because as life would have its synchronicities, I think I mentioned this with previous guests as well. A few of my listeners probably already know this. I stopped drinking alcohol about almost 12 months ago, right? I'm a health nut, right? And the drinking wine specifically, or, you know, a nice cold beer on a summer's day, was just a thorn in my side. It was like the one thing that I couldn't nail. And I did a challenge in January, and I ended up just continuing on.
Okay.
And so, like, over the last few months, there's been some stuff coming up, right? And it just occurred to me in the last probably 4 or 6 weeks, I've been covering all of that stuff up. That's why it was so difficult to get rid of the alcohol out of my life, because there's been all of this stuff that's been pushed down for many years. And so you don't even realize that's the reason you drink. You know, you talk about having a good time, and, you know, you like the taste, and it helps you to wind down and that sort of thing. But so I came to this discovery, I'm having a rant, and this realization recently, and I'm like, well, that's great, because I can put my finger on why I felt it was so difficult for me to do. Then only last week or the week before, one of my personal training clients gave me the link to Gabor Mate.
Yes.
His film. And I didn't watch the film, but I found a podcast of his, and I was like, what good timing. And I was just looking at your website today, and his name's mentioned, and I was like, brilliant.
Yeah. And look,
So
his body of
timely.
work,
My goodness.
his body of work is amazing. And especially in the addiction space, because when you start learning more about his work and then the autonomic nervous system, you clearly start seeing that almost anything can become addictive. And obviously we talk a lot about alcohol, drugs, gambling, all
sex,
those kinds of things. But there's almost anything, depending upon how you're using it, can actually become addictive and a way for you to cope.
Right. And I think, like, I know people who say that they're workaholics. And I think, well, maybe that's one. Shopping is another
shopping.
One. Gaming, like kids on games, and
And look, I think what is also really interesting about addiction is how things can transfer. So you feel like, okay, maybe you've got an issue with alcohol, and then you nip that in the bud, and then all of a sudden you're becoming a workaholic. And
or a readaholic.
So until you get to that, until you get to that root cause, it kind of just keeps on popping up in your life.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I've noticed that I'm reading a lot more, and, you know, I want to wind down on my own at night with a book, and it's like, yeah, cool. I enjoy reading fiction. That's normal, I think. But is it because it just quietens my mind down of all of the other stuff? You know, I think that it's fascinating. And also the fact that it doesn't have to be, he has a definition of addiction where it's like, you get pleasure, but the, what is it? The last, like, the effect of it starts to have a negative impact on your life.
Life. Yeah. It's something like that. And that is essentially what addiction is. So, and if you notice, and especially in the modern world, because I feel like the modern world fixates on us being busy on a 24/7 basis. And you're kind of brought up that you should be doing something all the time. I don't know what it's like for you, but I certainly notice this in holidays when the work becomes less. It's really hard to just sit and do nothing and not try to fill that space. But with the embodied processing work, I'd also say it's essential because it helps us to come back to what we're really feeling. So everything that we're doing, whether it's alcohol, shopping, gambling, it's serving a purpose. I mean, from my own personal experience, when I was very much a workaholic, some would still call me a workaholic, but I have been at a far more extreme end when I was younger. Like I was numbing so that I didn't have to think, feel about anything else. But society rewards you for that, right?
Yeah.
It's like employers want you to work on a 24/7 basis. If you're in your own business, which I imagine a lot of your audience is, that becomes even harder because you can literally just work 24/7 and keep on going, and you'll never run out of things to do. And then maybe one day you just burn out and then you're forced to stop. So there's also Bessel van der Kolk's "The Body Keeps the Score."
Okay.
And I think that's I love using that saying because if you think about it, it's correct. The body always keeps the score.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Yeah.
When you're unwell, even if you want to keep on going, it actually forces you to stop at a certain point.
Yeah. 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 Gives you all of the signs, doesn't it?
And then if you don't listen, it actually literally forces you and you become down and out. And obviously you want to avoid that because once you're in that state, it's quite hard to get back out of it.
Yeah. You've mentioned a couple of times your personal experience, and I watched a video of you being interviewed by the people who you did your practitioner program with. I think. And so do you want to talk to us a little bit about that? Because you talked about it realizing that that was an addiction. So what was your personal experience?
Yeah, sure. So I have to give a shout out to the creators of Embodied Processing.
Okay,
so
cool.
Ryan Hassan, who you saw in that video, and then Matt Nettleton as well. So they're the founders of Embodied Processing. So for me, what really led me to do that training was I was already doing the healing through writing work. And what I was finding in my sessions was that consistently trauma was popping up. And of course, I wasn't adequately trained to do anything with the trauma. So we'd almost touch on it and then I wouldn't feel it's ethical to go any further with it. And then I realized, and I came across the Centre for Healing who offers the Embodied Processing Practitioner, and I realized that I really needed to be able to work with trauma in these healing through writing sessions. But the way that the healing through writing sessions evolved was largely off the back of my own lived experience. So when I was about 13 to 23, I had anorexia.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's obviously a long time as well. And the unique part of my story, which is not something I advocate for at all, is that I never actually went into any professional treatment for it. So I had a period where I saw a psychologist for, I think it was 10 sessions, whatever was subsidized back then, because I think the other thing to mention is that I'm 35 now, but in terms of the eating disorder space, it's really come quite far from when I was going through this. So like we're talking about a couple of decades. So for example, when my mum first took me to the GP, no one really knew what anorexia was. So no one really took it seriously, is what I'm trying to say. There wasn't much education. Whereas now, if a 13-year-old went to the GP, it would be alarm bells, would be getting prevention, all that kind of thing. So my experience was that I went through this eating disorder. At 23, I started working, and that really helped me in terms of my recovery because I very quickly figured out that if I want to fit in with these people, they have to actually see me eating, at least at lunch. And then from there, things just started to get better and better. And what happened was the eating disorder kind of slowly slipped away as other things became more important in my life. So work became more important. People became more important because I started having connections and friendships, and we used to go out for a drink on a Friday night. I know we've just talked about giving up alcohol, but
it's all right. I know it's a thing, social thing.
Yeah. And then from about 23 to 30, my coping mechanism for that time of my life was to basically pretend it didn't happen. And for me, it was like my big dirty secret. And I was so scared about my employers at the time finding out about it and how that would then impact my career. And all kinds of, death scenario consequences going on in my mind as someone with anxiety would typically
Isn't that amazing?
have.
Like that you came to that conclusion that you could lose your job.
Well, exactly. And look, I guess the other thing to mention was, I heard a lot about how people were talking about other people who they thought were having an eating disorder. And the way that they were talking about them was quite harsh. And so all of that kind of sticks to you when you're going through that. And, 10 years, 13 to 23, that's a long time. That's like 10 years, right when you're developing, it's quite a transformative time of your life. So I had a lot of shame around it. And then when I hit 30, and I have no idea what sparked this, but suddenly I started having these like whispers in my head that I actually needed to go back and explore what happened at that time. So I had started my own business at the time. So that was like the major transition piece in my life. I'd gone from employment to my own business. And for some reason, I just couldn't let it go. And then I started educating myself, firstly about the eating disorders, then about anorexia specifically. And I very quickly figured out that it's out of all of the eating disorders, not that this is competition or anything, but it's the most deadly. So for me, having not been in professional treatment, it kind of started not making sense in terms of how I was still here, alive. Functioning. And look, I have to say,
and that it hadn't taken over your entire life, right? That it stopped like that.
Exactly.
Stories of people who people live with it for their entire life.
Well, exactly. And look, to be honest with you, I still see that now. And what I'm seeing is, I mentioned before, like awareness education is much better. What I see is that definitely helps with the younger people, because obviously they're still at home, they're still in the family unit, they've got mum or dad keeping an eye on them, noticing that things aren't quite right. But then you have this other cohort of people, 30s, 40s, 50s, who are still struggling with an eating disorder, which effectively means they'll live their whole lifetime with an eating disorder. So yeah, it's quite a hard thing to come out of. So tracking it back, I wanted to know how I did it. And when I started looking back, first of all, I should say, because every time I don't say this and I only talk about the writing, my mum gets really upset. So I have to say, my mum never gave up on me. So that was one really crucial factor, because if you think about it, 10 years is a really long time to constantly be at someone. And when I say constantly, it was like basically every meal. Every meal looked the same. I don't want to eat and she wants me to eat. And obviously we end up in a big fight. So have to say she was a big factor. But the other thing that I worked out was that the only thing I cared about, if I'm honest with you at the time, was writing. I loved writing, always been a really avid writer. It was the one thing that I could see a future for myself in. And then later, when I did all of my personal development, you said earlier that I'm an avid learner. That's correct. I'm always trying to learn something, figure something else out. I actually tracked back that what the writing was doing, it was helping me to get out of my head and all of the racing thoughts and back into my body, and to feel whatever I needed to feel, to process it. I do recall like shredding quite a lot of things that I wrote back then so that no one else would ever have to see them.
Okay.
But although you wouldn't say I was exactly thriving at the time, it essentially kept me alive until I was able to get to a point where I was okay enough to find other things that helped me in recovery. So for me, that shows me how powerful a tool writing is. And when I think about it, and earlier you mentioned empowering people, the one thing that I'm super passionate about is giving people tools to use, because I think it's really great to have an appointment with me as an embodied processing practitioner or a psychologist or whoever else. But these illnesses, disorders, however people label them, I personally don't resonate with the mental illness label on eating disorders. I actually think it's an addiction. I think it's an addiction because I used it in the same way as numbing myself. So I used it similar to the way someone uses alcohol or whatever else. So that's how I see it, as an addiction. But the thing is, none of these things take a break. If you're struggling at 1 a.m. in the morning, you're waking up and anxious, whatever it might be, and you have to wait to your appointment next week, that's not very helpful in the moment. And that's my personal experience too. So with writing, it's also very low barrier to entry. So you don't need a lot of money to write. You need pen, paper, something to type on. So that's the fantastic thing about writing. And then the other embodied processing techniques. So one of the foundational techniques is something called resourcing. So essentially that's just building a container of safety. And sometimes people can't resonate with the word safety because they've never felt safe in their life. So they can just think about support, stability, comfort, or if no language encompasses what I'm talking about, you could just think of the opposite of overwhelm. So it's called resourcing, and it's something that you cultivate over time. So it's not the kind of thing that you just do once and you've got exactly what I'm talking about. But that is a tool that you can use, that if you're triggered or whenever you're not feeling right, whatever it is, you come back to your resource.
Sure.
And it helps you to feel safe and supported in that moment. And same with other techniques, like, breathing techniques are quite common, that kind of thing. So I'm really, I guess, passionate about arming people with these tools, because really it's about incorporating them into your entire life. Because like I said earlier, healing is holistic. Kind of doesn't just work if you come to see me once a week for 45 minutes and nothing else in your life changes or adapts, or if you're not even doing any of. So I always say I give people homework. So I'm the evil practitioner. I give people homework. So sometimes the resourcing piece is interesting, because sometimes that's all we work on with the client until we're able to establish that. Because until we do that, it's actually quite dangerous to look at trauma, because we could end up re-traumatizing people.
Sure.
But really, like, practicing resourcing in the same way that you do meditation daily, that's what I'm an avid fan of. And it does take a little bit of time. And I can totally get this, because one of the reasons I actually came into this work also was I was having a lot of gut issues. And like, if you know about my story, it makes sense. Had an eating disorder. The gut issues actually didn't start until I went overseas and I had a really bad bout of food poisoning. And ever since that point, and look, let's be honest, my gut was not exactly optimal if you think about everything that I've just told you now, but my gut has been off. And that really, what happened was I got a diagnosis of irritable bowel syndrome, which, I don't want to knock this diagnosis at all, but for me, it was a bit of a nothing diagnosis, because it meant there was nothing they could do for me. I think I was told to go take some fiber, something like that. And that's not really the way you want to live when you're like early 30s. Like, didn't seem very. And then I started doing my own research and connecting the dots, and stress, emotions, all that kind of thing, huge factor with the gut, as you would know.
Yeah.
So that's what led me down this path as well. And like I said, I've been using these techniques on myself. And within a couple of years, I've been seeing a naturopath too. So that's the other important thing to mention. But within a couple of years, I've gone from a place where, so like 4 years ago, I would struggle to go to a work event that was all day and not be anxious and just the gut completely off. And gut issues are quite limiting, like life limiting, when you're having a lot of issues constantly. Whereas now, on a day-to-day basis, my gut is fine. Every now and again, what triggers my gut is nerves now. So if I'm nervous about something, which makes sense when you know a lot about the gut.
Yeah.
But I know these techniques work because I've used them on myself. And in the space of a couple of years, that's a pretty dramatic impact on someone's life. So, and then I get it when I hear people well, I don't want to spend 2 years doing all this. Like, I get it. And everyone's circumstances and life situation is different as well. It's like, I don't have kids, I don't have a partner. So I've got more time than the average person. Whereas if you've got kids and partner and other carer responsibilities even, it just makes everything harder. But like I said, I know it works through experience.
Yeah. Unfortunately, for a lot of people that they don't have time to work on them or take care of themselves until that emergency time where, like, as you mentioned before, the body goes, time out.
Not doing this anymore.
Yeah. So yeah, and I think that we've just come from a place where we live in a moment in time where the quick fix is the thing, right? The band-aid solution, and cover it over and move on.
Yeah, and look, I'd be lying to you if 6 years ago I'd have found the quick fix, I would have taken it too. It's just that I didn't find the quick fix. So that led me down a completely different route.
Yeah. So tell us about embodied processing.
Yes. So like I mentioned before.
What is it? Is it like tapping?
No. So it's a bottom-up approach to working with trauma. And like I said, a session can look very different, but one non-negotiable is the resourcing, which I mentioned earlier. So people typically come to me with an issue that they want to work on. So like say they want to work on anxiety, or maybe they're binging, so they want to work on that. And then from there, the first thing we do is we build and cultivate that resource. So depending upon the person, we can either do that in the first session, or maybe it takes 3, 4, 5 sessions. So from there, once we've got the resource down and we've
this is what we call like the bottoms up approach. It's like build a strong foundation.
Yeah, so I should explain. Bottom up approach is working with the body. So from the neck down. Yeah, so we're actually working with the body. So if you think about talk therapy, that would be more brain and mind.
Okay, so when you say bottom up, I just think from the bum.
Yeah, fair enough. But it's more so from the feet.
Okay, so how does that? Sorry. So when you talk about the bottoms up approach and the resourcing, what do you mean by that? Like, how do they work together?
Yeah. So with the resource, I should explain. There's a few different ways. Not at all. Other people are probably wondering this. And look, it is a challenge sometimes to actually communicate what this is as well, because it's not like a known modality.
Well-known. No.
Yeah, exactly. So with resourcing, there's a few different ways that we can find that safety. So ideally, we can find it in the body. Okay. So what that means is someone can feel into their feet, and they can feel safe with their feet on the floor, or it might be any other body part, maybe the heart, or for me, it's often the hands.
Okay.
So that's what we're talking about, feeling into that. And look, I guide people through the process as well. Okay. So that piece is very similar to guided meditation.
So would you so if you were helping someone do this, would you talk them through their physical body until they come to a place where they feel that that's where they feel safest?
Yeah, exactly. And then what we do from there is we anchor it in. Yep. So we're trying to create a kinesthetic anchor, because the memory has body. Yep. And the idea is that once we've got that anchor, if we're triggered and we need to in any situation, we can just use that anchor. So I'll give you an example just to help illustrate. So with my resource, I anchor my chest. I put one hand on the chest, one hand on the belly. Yeah. So one of my biggest triggers is public speaking. So for example, I had an event in November where I had to speak in front of 200 people. And to say I was nervous is an understatement. So
I think anyone would be.
Exactly. So I sat waiting for my session, and I just put hand on chest, other one on belly, completely discreet. And it actually helped to calm me. It doesn't, like, the whole purpose of resourcing is not to make what we label negative feelings go away. It's more about being able to feel them and contain them. So in that moment, I was able to feel into my resource. I could feel the butterflies in my stomach, but it wasn't at the point where I felt like I need to get up in front of everyone and run out of the room. So that's the difference. So
you connect it with any sort of internal language or anything, or
yeah,
like
we can do. I mean, it
like
depends on the client too, what's
okay.
coming up for them. So if they can associate anchor with a word, anchor with a word, we go with that. So it's all about really meeting the client where they're at, and everything is very heavily customized, which also makes it much harder to actually explain and expand on. And I should say, like, resourcing the body is much harder if someone has a lot of trauma. So that's why there's other options too. So we can find a resource in a person, a place, a thing, a pet.
Yeah.
Pets are really good ones. Most, like, people who have pets, that's a really good one. And then if all else fails, what we do is we go to an imagined place.
Yeah. Okay.
So like I said, super important to do the resourcing, because without that safety piece, without that container, and look, me as a practitioner, I'm also another resource.
Okay.
So, but what I'm trying to do, like I said earlier, is empower people that whenever they're triggered, they have these tools to go to.
Yeah.
So once we have that resource, because what we also don't want to do is re-traumatize people. And this will become clearer as I explain the process. So what we do after we've got that resource is we invite in the trigger. So working with that public speaking example, it would be me standing on a stage, 200 people staring at me, and the big thing for me was having a panic attack because I'd had them before while speaking. So obviously that gives you a few hang-ups, hey?
Yeah.
So we go to the trigger, and then once we've got the trigger, we try to feel what emotions are coming up. So for me, maybe it's panic, just completely feeling out of control. So once we've identified that emotion, we then try to feel it in the body. So where am I feeling that? Is it the increased heart rate, the butterflies in the stomach? So we're really trying to get tuned into our body and feel into what's happening for us in that moment. And as we're doing this, sometimes we're coming back to resource, depending upon how we're actually processing everything. Because if we're getting too overwhelmed, we need to come back. And what we can do is just use the resource to touch that experience, and then come back. Touch it and then come back. Because like I said, we don't want to re-traumatize ourselves throughout this entire process. So from there, depending upon the client, so once we're in the body, we've got the emotion. Depending upon what it is, sometimes we can look at the origins. So when did that first happen? Okay. So for example, in my instance, when did that first panic attack happen? And sometimes that can just help people to connect the dots. Because like I said earlier, when things make sense to us at a cognitive level, it's much more reassuring than just thinking, well, I'm having these panic attacks and I've got no idea why they're happening. Yeah. So, and then sometimes we can just skip straight to the processing. And so processing the actual emotion, and there's a range of different tools and techniques that we use depending upon who the client is, where they're at, what we've done with them in the past. So that would be things like breathing techniques. What I mentioned before in terms of touching the trigger and then coming back, that's called pendulation. Okay. So sometimes we can also merge with the emotion as well. So it kind of just depends on what's going on. And then what we also, once we do from there, is we come back to the trigger and we feel into that and we see what's happening for us. And sometimes what will happen is that intensity will reduce just by going through the process and feeling whatever we need to in that moment. But I mean, it's super important to be clear. And I'm always clear, like, there's no promises with this work, because you never know what you might touch on or what else we might discover along the map in trying to get to this trigger.
So would you, if someone came to you with some kind of eating disorder or addiction, right? And they want to, like, ultimately they want to stop. So they've got a sugar addiction, right? For example, and they ultimately want to stop the sugar addiction. Does your process, first of all, is there a process that, like, kind of uncovers that it might not be the sugar addiction that's the thing?
That's exactly what it is.
And you
because
kind of,
we always end up somewhere else. So they come to me for the sugar addiction, but we end up maybe it's in their childhood, maybe it's, you know,
And
maybe their
so-
mum told them not to eat, or it could be anything.
Yeah. So when they go home and they're using these tools in their everyday life, do they might have the thought of they want sugar, and then they can use their techniques to bring them back.
Actually, sugar's a really good example, because I had a client with sugar addiction. So we did a few sessions, and then what happened was I said to her, look, when you're feeling like you want to binge, that was her particular problem. What I'd like you to do is to use the resource and just see what happens. And I have to say, it takes some practice to go from that moment of I want to binge, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, because
for you.
it can be like that.
Yeah, and you don't even know
they've done it before they've even thought about it.
Yeah, that's essentially dissociation. So what I'm trying to do in these sessions is to get people to reconnect with the wisdom of their body.
Yeah.
And then we just track that over time. And also I should mention that throughout the process, depending upon how the client likes to work, I'm also using writing prompts as well.
Yeah.
Because sometimes what I find is the presence piece can be hard for people at the beginning. So, and look, I found this too. So when my gut was really bad, I really wanted to be doing stuff like meditating and that kind of thing, but just sitting still and doing this work was almost impossible, because I was just so uncomfortable that it wasn't possible for me to be present, because all I could think about was the contractions and the pain in my gut. So, and then really at the end of the session, we're checking back in with the nervous system. And what we're really trying to do, if I had to say it in a nutshell, is we're trying to get this nervous system regulated, because so many people have nervous system dysregulation, and that pops up in their area, in their life, in all kinds of areas. So really it's about nervous system regulation, and that will look different in terms of the end of the session, depending upon where people started. I mean, if their nervous system is starting at a dysregulated intensity state of 10, well, then getting to say a 5, that's a great thing at the end of the session. So it's really just working in with where people are at, and accepting whatever pops up in the session as well. So sometimes people feel the need to cry. Sometimes people are yawning, which is good, because it's a sign that the nervous system is down regulating. Sometimes people need to move. Depends what emotions pop up as well. So like with something like anger, I'm not going to tell people to sit there and process anger. No, we're going to get up. We're going to pump our fists, whatever else is coming up in that moment. So it depends on on the emotions coming up as well.
Okay, cool. Okay. So let's talk about that. On your website, it says feeling is not a dirty word, and you've talked a lot about feeling into your body. And you've kind of touched on the embodied processing, which obviously, you know, putting two and two together, we're coming back to our body, the wisdom of our body. What does that mean? Is it like is it simply identifying, like, where am I, if you have an emotion, where am I feeling this in my body? And does it go beyond the container, or the, like, as you said, you know, needing to pump your fist if you're having a particular emotion?
Yeah. So to explain that a little bit, like, the average person is completely disconnected with what's going on in their body on a day-to-day basis. And it's really easy to see why in the modern world, because most of us have this to-do list that's longer than we're likely ever going to live. And what that means is that we're in this constant state of anxiety, where we're moving from one thing to another thing, and actually sitting with ourselves, coming back to the body, feeling what we're feeling in that moment becomes rarer and rarer the more responsibility we have. So it's a way to check in with yourself and to connect with what you're really feeling in the moment. And just to try to explain it with a little bit of an example. So for example, when I had my eating disorder, my workaholism, which then I just swapped one problem for another problem. My workaholism was essentially to numb myself, because there were a number of areas of my life I didn't want to look at, and I didn't feel like I had the capacity to look at. Whereas now it's completely different for me, because in each and every individual moment, I'm able to actually come back to myself and feel what I'm feeling. And from there, it's almost like a internal inquiry. Well, why is my heart beating strangely in this moment? What's going on? Rather than just living 100% of my life in the cognitive mind, which, as I said, is super easy to do, especially when we're living in a world that prioritizes intellect and rewards intellect above all else. But essentially, we're not just the brain, we're not just the mind, we're a whole physical body. So the way that we've almost cut up the body into mind, body, spirit, I don't know why we've done that, because we're human and all parts of ourselves work in unison. And when one thing is off, almost everything is off.
Yeah, cool. I could go down a few different
which one to pick?
What direction? Well, we haven't talked about your writing yet.
No.
And I know you've mentioned to me in a message that sometimes your clients find it very difficult to even take 5 minutes of writing, or maybe even less, 5 lines. Did you start with writing first, or did you create your coaching practice with both?
Yeah, so I started with writing first. So like I mentioned, my personal experience was more so with the writing than it was with embodied processing, because that came much later on.
And then you were noticing the traumatic stuff, the trauma stuff coming up. But
I think sometimes when I say writing, people often get the wrong idea, because I'm not necessarily talking about writing a novel every single day. Like, for some people, it just looks like words.
Right, okay.
Or disjointed sentences, it can look like slabs and slabs of writing. So everyone is quite unique in that sense. And what I say to people, just to try to get them into the habit of writing daily, because again, we're trying to come out of the mind back into the body. And where I've really, I guess, tweaked journaling or diary writing, whatever you want to call it, is that I don't advise people to just brain dump. So it's not just a matter of getting everything off their brain and onto a piece of paper and never looking at it again. No. I think with my process, I'm encouraging people to look at words or paragraphs or sentences and feel into the body. When I'm writing about a certain experience, what am I feeling in my body? Is my heart rate increasing? Am I getting the butterflies in the stomach? Am I feeling hot? Is there something that's inciting anger within me? Because all of these things are little clues that we can work with. So essentially, again, just becoming connected with what's really happening in the moment, rather than the reality we're creating with the mind. So I always say to people, look, while I would love to say you would have 20 to 30 minutes a day to create this wonderful, I think people get this very romantic idea of writing, that they have to be in the forest, in the trees, beautiful stationery, maybe some light music in the background while they write for 20 to 30 minutes. Maybe they've got some essential oils handy. You know, that's not the reality of the average person's life. So I say to people, 5 minutes, even less than that, whatever you can manage a day is better than nothing. And don't get so caught up, because I know this has come up with clients before, on when you're doing it. Because some people are very rigid, as in, if they've set that they need to do their 5 minutes before work and it doesn't happen, they won't try to incorporate it in like in between a meeting or at night before bed. It's just, it means it's not done for the day. So I'm not a proponent of that. I think you just need to fit it in your life, and it should fit around your life, not the other way around. You're not going to structure your whole day about when you're going to get your 5 minutes of writing in. So, and then from there, depending upon where you're writing, you can use different prompts. So like, for example, if you are writing at the beginning of the day, you could go with something like, what's my intention for the day? If you are writing at lunch, you could do something like, what on my to-do list can wait until tomorrow? And that's a really good one for those who are a bit anxious, trying to get things off the to-do list. And then like, if you're doing it before bed, you could do something like, what is one thing I've done today that has moved me closer to my short or long-term goals? So that's just a nice way of reflecting back on the day. And then over time, really, I find people don't need the prompts anymore, because as they become more connected with their body and what's happening with them in that moment, they kind of just can freestyle and write. And sometimes you even get surprised in terms of what you put down on the paper.
Yeah.
And they're really the gems.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting. I try and do a bit of journaling every day, and my I don't like saying rule. The thing that I do is like, sometimes it's like, open the book, write one sentence is the bare minimum. It's like keep in the habit of doing it. But I encourage the people, the clients I have as well, to journal, because we get, when you mentioned, you know, we're always thinking about all of the things we've got to do and filling our time with busyness, but we can literally just be talking ourselves round and around and round in circles, can't we? Yeah. And then you get a pen and a piece of paper and you start writing it down. Firstly, there can be some real relief, because it's like, okay, it's written down now, I don't have to keep thinking about it. But also some stuff can come out that you're like, oh
yes, we've all had those moments, haven't we?
That.
And look, if you're more prone to anxiety, I think writing is a really good tool, because like I said before, it can be hard to be still and present if you have a lot of anxiety, whereas writing, you're actually doing something. And as long as you're using your hands, because there's healing power in the hands. So whether you're typing or physically writing, I mean, you're really tuning into yourself and in that moment, and whatever pops up. And also, don't judge what pops up. I think that's another thing that sometimes people do, or they get caught up on the quality of the writing. Like, no one cares if this is not the next Harry Potter. No. And in some cases, and, you know, I think there's two schools of thought on destroying or keeping your writing. So I think for me, for the more day-to-day stuff, I like keeping it, just because it gives me the opportunity at the end of the week, I can look back on the week and ask myself, what's consistently energizing me, and then what's consistently draining me, and out of those two, what can I incorporate more of, and what can I take away? And then if it's something, so maybe I wanted to have a look back at a past experience, maybe when I was at my sickest with my anorexia or something, I would shred it. And that really, I think that eliminates a few things, the chance of anyone finding it. And also it gives you a wonderful freedom to just write whatever needs to be written in that moment, without, even at a subconscious level, you needing to worry about anything at all, really.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Blah, blah, blah. What else was I going to ask you? I can't remember. Let's talk a little bit more about you. We're getting close to almost an hour.
It's flown by.
I know, and it's fascinating what you do. But let's talk about what on an everyday level for you. How do you use these tools? Do you use these tools every day?
Yes, I'm a big believer in embodying what you stand for. So I'll give you a typical rundown of my day. So first thing when I wake up, I will do some resourcing. So I have some meditations, guided meditations that I just use first thing in the morning. And that goes for about 10 minutes. Then I have another meditation that I typically, it's like my go-to meditation for another 10 minutes. But sometimes if I'm not feeling in the mood, I'll switch that one out. And then before I even sit at my desk, I go on a walk. So walking is a big part of my routine, because I find it really good for my mental health. So I'll go on a walk, about 40 minutes it usually takes me. And then I'll also do some quick journaling, writing, check again, how am I feeling today? And that's when my work day starts. And then usually before the end of the day, I'll go on another quicker, shorter walk. So maybe like a 20-minute walk. And then before bed, I always try to incorporate some more resourcing. So I'm starting the day and then ending the day with that feeling of safety. And it's very hard. So just listening to this and not having the experience, it's hard to actually put into words and use language to describe what an impact that can have on you. Providing, I mean, like all modalities, embodied processing won't be the modality for everyone, nor will writing. But for the people who are really attracted to this work and who are drawn, there's a little inkling inside them that something is not quite right and they can't feel anything in their body. I mean, this work is really powerful. And it can be really powerful.
Yeah, yeah. Do you think that, I mean, because you talked about specifically, you know, working with people who, with eating disorders or disordered eating, two different things.
Yes, two different things.
Yeah. Addiction, anxiety. General person comes to you because they're interested in finding out what it is and they just want to get more in touch with their body. Does that happen? Do people do
it does happen sometimes.
And do you get to a point and you're like, there's trauma?
Well, like I said before, everyone has trauma on a spectrum. So I think the best way to explain it is that everyone has their issues. And obviously we focus today on more like the big ticket issues. So like the anxiety, eating disorders, disordered eating, people who, you know, things like the scale, like so many women are just, I'm sure you see this with what you do as well. Like food is just controlling their life in a way that it shouldn't be. It should be part of your life, not something that you plan. It's like something like going out for a meal becomes a big anxiety inducing event. So that kind of stuff. But on the flip side, like people have lots of other issues. So like maybe relationship problems, maybe unsure of what to do in their career. Like almost everything can be explored and investigated. And I think it's up to the practitioner that if they're not seeing progress to then refer the person on and just be honest. But like I say to you, like I never make any promises with people because that's not my line of work. It's very much a complementary modality. So it doesn't replace any other professional medical treatment or anything like that. So I think it's important to be clear with people as well.
You've got to be fairly curious, I guess, about what's going on for yourself, haven't you? Like,
well, exactly, and look,
be prepared to get in there and have a dig around.
Yeah, sometimes it's easier not to be curious, and I get that too because it can open up a can of worms. And I think you need to be ready to do this work. Is the best way to say it.
Yeah. What is your? Do you have a vision, a dream for your business or for the work that you do?
Oh
like, what's your passion?
That is a big question to end on. To be honest with you.
In one sentence.
I think because of my past, a lot of it is around eating disorders and breaking the stigma and the shame because that helps no one. It really helps no one to spend, like I did, even once you've recovered, another 7 years, scared to death that you've got this dirty little secret. Like for me, I think that's the biggest thing. And I know that we talk a lot more about mental health and mental illness, but trust me, the stigma is still very much there. The misinformation is still very much there. And I think like all these kinds of things, the only reason people really get curious about it in their own lives is when it's impacting them. So maybe their child starts having, they're noticing some stuff in their child or a relative or a friend, and then that door of curiosity opens. But like I said earlier, for me, I don't resonate with the label mental illness. It's more, I resonate more with addiction. And really, like for me, the label is not helpful at all. It's kind of something that we just use. But my eating disorder experience is completely unique, and other people's experience will be unique too. And as long as you find a way out, whatever that looks like, I think you just need to go with whatever you're drawn to. But I do think it needs to be a holistic approach.
And cool. I wonder, without going on too much. You know how you've said that there's stigma attached to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that about a lot of body image stuff as well. And you said, you know, back when you were 13, there wasn't a lot that people knew about anorexia. And gradually over time, there's more knowledge. But you've also mentioned, you know, the term mental illness. Is it because we have so much information available to us? Like, how much is the media, do you reckon, influencing all of those things, and the stigma that's attached to body image, or the stigma that's attached to behavioral issues, addictions, that sort of thing?
So
responsible.
That's a big question. And I think
sorry.
the discussion, no, all good. I'll try not to go on too much of a tangent here, but the discussion often comes back to social media.
Yes.
And I don't think social media has helped at all, because we're very, very, very focused on all things physical and almost creating these little movies of ourselves, because no one posts, well, very few people post about their crappiest times in their life. They're all posting when they're on the beach and looking glam and photoshopping everything. So I definitely don't think it's helped. However, eating disorders were around a long time before social media. So I think media has a role to play. I don't think we can point the finger solely at media, but they can either help or hinder. And look, there is some really good educational content out there on media, and media's, you know, it's like everything. And the other problem that media faces, and I know this because of my background, I'm a journalist.
Right.
Everything lives on clicks and views. Yes. And what gets people to click? The most sensationalist headlines around. You know, people don't want to read a boring story about whatever it might be. They want all the facts. But I do think that they have a responsibility to report in a way where they recognize triggers and select things like mentioning weights, all that kind of thing. They need to be aware of that kind of thing. I think they've gotten better at that, but there's always room for improvement. And it depends which media outlets you're talking about as well.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yes. I'm just very aware that the evolution of how people talk about their bodies as well, and the way that they look, and so I'm just sort of curious about the influence of media. Like, is it created by them? But let's end on this note before we say farewell. I agree that there's good and bad in social media. And one of the great things is that there are people like you who are able to get out there and talk about what you do and the people that you support, and put a positive voice to it. And we met on social media, and one of the great things is that we do meet some great people. So if we can ignore the shit and focus on the good stuff, there are some advantages. I'm sorry that question came up at the end. I'm just trying to get to the bottom of it.
No, I think, you know, it's a worthy question to ask, and you're right. It's like everything. It can be used to help or hinder, because when you bring up social media, the connections that you're able to make on social media that you never would have been able to make years ago before the advent of social media. Like, for me, the benefits outweigh the risks. But I do think it's something that we need to be aware of, especially probably with younger people. Because I think there's some really interesting research coming out about how screens and all that kind of stuff impacts the development of the brain. So I think that is definitely something to be aware of. But in terms of, I mean, I'm in my mid-30s, how I'm using social media now, very beneficial. And I'm very discerning with what I take in. Anything that's not helpful, I just block, unfollow, all that kind of stuff. So good tips. Sarah,
Thank you so much for joining us. How can people find you? And we'll put all your info in the show notes as well. But do you want to share with us what, how, if people were interested in finding out more about what you do, what's the best way to connect with you?
Sure. So you can just go to my website, which is storytellingforthesoul.com.au, or if it's easier, you can just use my name. So it's just sarahcannata.com. And then I'm across all social media, Storytelling for the Soul. So Facebook, Instagram, what else is there? Pinterest. The best place, though, to follow me is on Facebook, because that's where I'm most active. So
cool.
Massive thank you for having me. And
no
for this
worries.
amazing in-depth conversation.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for sharing this, a relatively new modality that can help improve people's lives and health.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I'll speak to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.